thank you all for joining us for the latest of our tea break sessions. For those who've been along before, you'll know the general format and process of it. But today we're going to be taking a slightly different format and looking at the
audience agency ticketing sales data dashboard.
Oh, I'm not sure what someone's done there. So yes, we will indeed, as our surprise robot is saying, going to be looking at the ticketing sales dashboard. So by way of introductions, I'm Oliver Mantell. I'm Director of Evidence and Insight for the Audience Agency. And I am, for description purposes, a blonde-haired, white, middle-aged male. And I will be accompanied by, and indeed most of the chat will be from my colleague Elise, who is waving on camera there. So Elise Boileau, our evidence researcher. So I will let her introduce and describe herself in a sec. But essentially what we'll be doing is showing you this dashboard that has been available via our website for a year or so now. But we're aware that not necessarily everybody knows it's there. So we thought it'd be useful to point it out and point out some few examples of how to use it, a couple of examples of things that we can see from it. We'll have a little bit of input from our colleague Chris France to sort of talk about what it might look like, and then a chance to have a bit of a chat and a Q&A later on. So it's the usual format. Again, this is meant to be nice and relaxed, so feel free to just tune in, have a cup of tea, and we will take it from there. So Elise, if you want to just move us on to the first bit, is just to say what we're going to be doing is it's using Audience Finder data, so the data we collect from all the different systems around the country into Audience Finder. That's the transactional data, but it's a different view on that data. So it's not a direct feed from Audience Finder. We kind of take it out and then process it to the dashboard. But it is available on our website if you'll advance us one more. So if you go to the Audience Agency website, you'll see the tabs across the top. Evidence is the one to click for evidence. That's that one there. So all of our evidence content will live under that tab in one way or another. But you see on the right, there's a list of different types of categories. And right in the middle there, it says sales. You click on that, it's the first big red button just when you scroll down. So that's where you'll find it. And indeed, possibly why people haven't found it as much in the last year as they otherwise could have done, because it's a couple of clicks in. But we'll do a bit of a run through and show you what we think might be helpful from it. So I'm going to pass over to Elise to start explaining how it works, and then we'll chat about a couple of particular examples after that. So over to you, Elise.
Thanks, Oliver. I hope you can all hear me now. We are going to look at the actual dashboard now and see it in action. So here it is. I've gone through the sales page that we were just looking at, and it's taken me to the dashboard, which you can see here. This is the introductory page. And essentially, as Oliver was saying, for the audio description, so my name is Elise Boileau, and I am a white woman with short dark hair. So this is what the first page of the dashboard looks like. This is your introductory page. And I'm going to give you a bit of a tour of the dashboard and some pointers, possibly at how you can make it work for you. And first off, navigation. As you can see, there are 7 different pages with data in them, along with an intro page and an info page at the end, which tells you a little bit more about how it was made and what's in there. And to navigate, you can either click these arrows here at the bottom, or you can click directly on this list of pages and it will take you straight through to where you want to go. And you can see you find those icons again here at the bottom on the right, so you can use these to navigate and sort of make sense of what you're looking at. And broadly, we have a page looking at income, a page looking at bookers by week of the year, a page looking at tickets, and then you have 2 pages looking at income by region, and this is specifically for NPO organizations in those regions for sake of consistent data set. So one that drills down to the dates of the year, and then one that's view by week of the year. And I'm sort of skimming through these now, but we'll look into in a little bit more detail at what we can find on each page. This is just to give you an overview overall of what's in here. And then finally, you can also look at each audience spectrum type throughout the year, and art forms. Although art forms has not been updated of the most recent years, you can see it only goes up to 2019. And that is because with the pandemic, there was a drop in performance categorization. So we were unable to include it because it would have just shown an erroneous picture. So if I just take one page to kind of show you how it works in the structure, because it might look a bit intimidating at first, seeing a big graph with lots of colors. So essentially, each page has a main graph, which shows you whichever metric we're looking at by week of the year. Here you have the weeks 0 to 53, as there's on average 53 weeks in the year. And you can see at the bottom there, you also have a summary total for each of these lines. So for example, this is in 2017, there were 38.97 million tickets sold, and it's this gray line that you can see sort of in the background. And this slicer at the bottom here, this sort of line, allows you to shorten the view if you want to focus in on something, or just take the long view. So that's sort of our this sort of view for the sort of main metrics. And a little bit briefly about, you can see the end of the year and the start of the year are looking a bit funny, not as smooth maybe as throughout the year. And that is simply because with this, taking every year as 53 weeks is not entirely accurate. Some years only have 52 weeks and so on. And so the week at the end of the year will often be less than 7 days, and at the start of the year also less than 7 days. So it looks like it's plummeting, but most likely there was just less data in that week compared to previous weeks. And it's the same as why this green line here, which is 2022, the start looks very, very low, but actually if you look at week number 2, it's showing a more consistent view. So it's more likely that this first week didn't have the same number of days. I can't see the chat right now, so if there's anything, feel free to let me know, Ollie.
I will do, yes.
Yes.
Is it worth us doing a little bit of description of what this is showing, just to clarify what the picture is?
Yeah. So this, what we can see here with the tickets is in orange, you have the 2020 line. And we can see here, week 10 or 11 is pretty much with the start of the lockdown, the first lockdown in the UK. And we can see where the ticket numbers really go down and then stay down all through the year, where we had lots of lockdowns and where organizations couldn't really open very much. And then a similar picture throughout the start of 2021, with then it being able to grow a bit more. And then a drop down again with Omicron coming in the way at the end of that pink line. But now at the start of 2022, we can see it's actually coming back pretty close to the levels of previous years, even though it's not quite up to its previous levels yet. So this is kind of, in light of COVID, the picture that we're seeing, and that this chart can really show us. So this is why we were talking about using the dashboard to take a long view of really having a look at how COVID has impacted the sector, and how our audience finder ticketing data set can really show us that. So it's a similar picture when we look at the income. We see again a very similar shape of that orange line going down, the pink line slowly catching up, and then this trend continuing with the green line, which is 2022. Then if we move on to views by region, just to kind of explain how it works here, it's very similar, except it's instead of having just one line per year, you have one line per region, and then you can select. So for example, I could look at 2021 for all regions, and I could see the evolution, and I can see here that nationally the picture is growing, but it's mainly that dark blue line, which is Greater London, that stays on top, and all the others are much lower. And then you can also do the same thing by audience spectrum segment. And again, here you have a line for each year for each segment. So it might look a bit intimidating if you see all the lines, but all you've got to do is select the ones that are relevant to you. So if you have a lot of community land culture buffs or metroculturals in your data set, then you can kind of see what goes on for them and what the picture is. And then that's a chance for you to really see the evolution and see how your potential audiences are behaving or are starting to behave, and how that might be changing in light of COVID. Yeah, so this is just a sort of overview of the various functionalities. One last thing I'll mention is those week numbers, which kind of form the main axis of all these charts. So unfortunately, they don't show, concretely what number that represents. What you can do is find a sort of week numbers for the year converted. This is just the first one I could find on Google, and then you can look up for a week number which states they relate to. But generally speaking, week 10 is around beginning of March, week 20 is around mid-May, week 30 is around end of July, sort of middle of the summer. Week 40 is beginning of October, and roughly week 50 is end sort of mid-December. So I hope that sort of helps make sense of it. Oliver, do you think I'm missing anything about how to make sense of the spreadsheet and the data set?
Did you just touch on the art form stuff? That might be.
Yeah, so here is the page about art forms. As we mentioned, we're not showing anything past 2019. But in the same sense here, you have a line per art form per year. So I could look at just 2019, and this is children family, and now here I could add different art forms, and it's just going to take a little while to update. There we go. So I can do most of the art forms in relation to each other. I can see the average of the last 3 sort of full years that we have. And this kind of just shows us, in comparison to each other, with how different performances of different art forms, how they behave. So for example, we see that pink line, which is Christmas shows, it very clearly, it does nothing throughout the year, and then it peaks around the Christmas period and tapers off there in January. And then it can show us, for example, that if we look just at these children family shows, we can see that they tend to have big peaks and troughs, and we can kind of see that these are correlating to when there are bank holidays or half-term holidays. So for example, these weeks 14, 15, 16 are roughly spring half-term, and then over here week 42, 43, that's towards mid-autumn, and then at the end here, of course, we've got the Christmas holidays. So it kind of shows it with actual sales data that's been aggregated from the whole sector in the whole country. We can have sort of direct proof that children and family shows, excuse me, are correlating quite strongly with holidays. So these are just examples of different findings that you can see through looking at this yearly view, taking a long view of audience finder data. So I think that gives you a pretty good overview. We'll be able to answer if you have any particular questions later on how this all works. But I'm going to hand back over to Oliver to give us some more examples of particular findings that we were able to pull out of this dashboard.
Great, thanks, Elise. And obviously, as noted in the chat, people are always, I think, keen to have a bit of a play themselves, and that's very much, the purpose of this is going to encourage you to have a bit of a look, see what it's showing. It's also useful, I think, as when you're looking at data for a particular art form, it's a way of sort of checking, well, actually, which particular types of data are likely to be in there. How much film data is in there, or whatever. It gives you a bit of a chance to look at that. So just a couple of examples I'm going to talk you through is just a way that we can use this to give us a picture of how particular audience groups are behaving in relation to attendance in general, and also attendance sort of specifically in relation to COVID as they come back. So the first example we're going to look at, so this is going to the audience spectrum page, is just a quick look at the trips and treats group. So we see there, so trips and treats on average, they could have, carry on through the year. It's a similar-ish shape to the one we saw for the overall sales, but with a particularly prominent spike at Christmas, because again, it's a group that has lots of young families in, maybe more attracted to more popular work, like things like Christmas shows and panto. And if we overlay metroculturals on that, we can start to see that pattern. So in general, metroculturals engage more than trips and treats, despite the fact that they're a much smaller group within the population. They still, outnumber them in terms of sheer audience numbers, let alone propensity to engage. But once we get to the Christmas period, suddenly those two groups flip, because metroculturals, generally speaking, aren't as interested in that popular and family product. So you do see a bit of a contrast there. So if that's the sort of the normal picture, we can then look sort of year by year at how these groups compared. So here we've got metroculturals very clearly on top with the sort of peachy line. Again, once you get past the Christmas period, and then come lockdown, they both dropped very heavily. But again, metroculturals are a little bit more likely to have tried to nudge their way back as and when they could. So numbers are very low, but still it's roughly sort of double as opposed to just a little bit higher, as we saw previously. So if we now look on to 2021, as things came back, the metroculturals now in Lime, you can see a much sort of steeper rise once things opened up, staying ahead, but again, at points being caught up by trips and treats. And again, once you hit the Christmas period, there's now really quite a pronounced gap between the two segments. And if we then move into this year, we can see that the metroculturals, whilst they're sort of re-establishing their lead again once we get past the Christmas period. So it's a way of, we can kind of track pairs of segments to see the kind of the relative propensity and patterns of engagement. And it reinforces the picture that I think we've said a few times to people about those kind of urban groups being particularly keen to come back and attend, and those with maybe some more contemporary tastes. However, for metroculturals and trips and treats, there is a slight blurring of the picture, because trips and treats have loads of families in them, and we know families have been really keen to attend. So a sharper contrast we can get by looking at a different pair of segments. So for this, we're just going to look at experience seekers and home and heritage. And here you can see, although experience seekers typically a bit of a higher engaged group than home and heritage, but they're less likely to sort of spend lots of money, so they appear a little bit lower in the mix on kind of paid for content. And so what we're seeing across a typical year is that we are seeing slightly higher levels of the home and heritage, mid-engaged, bit older, bit more rural, as opposed to these kind of young graduates and sort of professionals in this experience seekers group. So that was the kind of, if you like, the background picture. Notice we're not getting that particular spike at Christmas that we saw really strongly with the trips and treats, and indeed in the overall sales. So we are getting a bit of a rounded end to the year. When we look on to 2020 itself, though, similar picture to before. So they both, drop off this cliff in March. But again, the lilac of the experience seekers, they're relatively highly, they're highly engaged, they're interested, they're urban, and they're kind of nudging to get back as soon as they can. So although numbers stay low, they're much less low than we're seeing on the home and heritage, who to a very large extent are just saying, we're staying out of it, we're staying out of busy areas, we're staying out of venues. Then when we move on to 2021, that same kind of picture persists, that as things open up, sort of once we get 4 or 5 months into the year, things really open up, experience seekers take off quite quickly, the gap sort of persists, and we're essentially seeing these two segments the opposite way up to the way they were in a sort of normal year. So relatively speaking, it's the home and heritage that we're losing in terms of engagement. And indeed, when you then look at the current figures, that kind of situation is persisting, such that when we, if we can just look at experience seekers for 2017 to 19 alongside 2022, so we take 2021 out, you see, so that's getting not too far off what it was, whereas home and heritage is a little bit further down. So yeah, you see that gap is a little bit more extensive. So overall, what it's showing us is this picture that we've seen through the survey data from the Cultural Participation Monitor. We've seen through obviously anecdotal feedback and so forth, that the profile of particular groups who are and aren't engaging is really kind of both affected by seasonality very strongly, but also has been affected by COVID in really marked ways. So that's just a little sort of run through a few examples. I think I'm going to pass over to our colleague Chris, who will just give his thoughts on the dashboard and what it might be useful for.
Yeah, so thanks for that sort of intro, Oliver. So yeah, for those of you that don't know me already, I know some of you do on the call today, my name's Chris. I'm in my mid-30s, male, short brown hair, and so tall. My role at the audience agency is head of audience finder service. So essentially that means I am mainly helping organizations and individuals use the actual platforms and data tools across the audience finder offer, which are audience finder original, audience finder show stats, and audience finder answers. But also, of course, I have a very keen interest in the data set as well from that sort of side. And I think I've certainly been one of the most earliest people, hopefully within TA, that's been quite interested in looking at this dashboard, particularly as time has gone on and since it was first launched back in 2020. It's probably fair to say that when it was first put together, it maybe wasn't the most optimistic picture, seeing lots of those lines, as Elise and Oliver showed you just there, going down quite quickly. But certainly now we sort of get into this sort of stage of essentially of a recovery across the UK from the pandemic. Certainly without using that term post-COVID, it certainly feels like we're a lot more of a positive picture post-lockdown. Now we similarly around sort of 6 to 9 months pretty much for most organisations in England since they reopened from the pandemic as well. A slightly different picture, as we know, both from Scotland and Wales, of course, because of essentially government restrictions, of course. Both the Scottish and Welsh organisations did start a little bit later on, and generally their recovery feels a little bit further on there, but certainly a good sort of stage now from what a majority of the data set, of the ticketed data set in this case, of course, are showing in terms of the data as well. The data set itself, just as a short sort of overviews from that as well, and included in the document, including in the dashboard that's just shown just there. We've got just under 520 organisations now, ticketed organisations that are contributing to the data set. So hopefully, or we'd like to think so at least, obviously a pretty robust representative of obviously what the UK sector is doing overall. Within that, obviously organisations from England, Scotland and Wales, and also a few from Northern Ireland as well, to be able to add that to the mix as hopefully something that is relatively robust from that sort of extent that can show a full picture. Yeah, as I was mentioned, I think from my sort of side, obviously, we sort of think from that point of view of sort of where we're at in terms of the post-recovery picture. Of course, as Oliver mentioned there, and I think obviously it's a fair summary to sort of state from our wider research, but also from other research, both of course on the population, but also of course on direct bookers, performing arts bookers, and otherwise as well. But attitudes to attendance are quite complex at the moment in terms of how things are changing as well. Obviously, the new variant back at Christmas did maybe have a little bit of a stumble in terms of a few sort of backward steps from that point of view. But thinking for me, a few sort of the main elements that sort of particularly sort of jumped out from me from sort of looking back at it, and also looking back at the original report that was also part of this, which was called the Backlight Report as well, which I think, or if you click through some of those links that have just been posted in there, you'll be able to have a little bit of have a look at it as well, which was published back in 2020. Some of the main sort of metrics I've particularly been looking at, actually, some of those audience spectrum metrics as well that Oliver was mentioning, particularly now as we get into this period. So both of you who are working in organisations, I know some of you on the call today are directly working with organisations that are contributing ticketing data, so you can look at your dashboard. Of course, some of you are not, of course, but either way, you know, you can hopefully have a look at this data and have a look to sort of see what the audience was looking like, of course, in terms of a pre-COVID picture, but also as you can start to see some sort of obviously trends, obviously in relation to some of the actions that I sort of mentioned, to have a little bit of a look at as well. So certainly thinking about the spectrum way would be a good sort of way to start, particularly those of you, I know, again, just from seeing some of the people who are on the call today, some of those higher and medium engaged groups, particularly community land culture buffs and particularly metro culturals for a few of you as well, to have a little bit look at how they're tracking. Of course, those slight differences that Oliver just sort of mentioned as well. I think it'd be really interesting to see over the course of time, just sort of see how they continue to perform against what they were before the pandemic as such. Of course, some small differences which may well, of course, just be due to the total amount of performances and otherwise as well, but also just to sort of see how they respond as well, and also seasonally as well, because of course we are, well, from my inbox at least, just from a cultural consumer as such, just starting to see lots of obviously productions and marketings for longer spring, summer runs and things like that as well, and some more of the productions that clearly arts organisations, particularly in the theatre, are investing in a little bit higher. So I think it'd be particularly interesting to see as this goes on, using the dashboard to sort of see how that affects on a spectrum level as well. Also particularly thinking about the income brackets as well, a little bit that Elise just sort of showed at the start of that as well, just to sort of see how that works back again compared to the 17-19 average. Again, obviously pricing and income has been quite a big topic recently within the sector, in other webinars and conferences particularly, and also hearing a lot from audience finder youth who's just sort of thinking about how to sort of re-tackle this challenge as well, not just in relation to sometimes the Marmite topic of dynamic pricing, but just sort of think about that as well, around that as well. So looking at those income levels and how they work both on a regional split as well, I think it's been quite interesting for me. Obviously looking at England, if we can break down and particularly look at, say, London and the southeast, we can sort of see that obviously that just performing a little bit differently to what it is regionally as well. So I think looking to sort of track how that would be, again, of course you can do that in the dashboard that Elise mentioned in the income section. To have a look at that and how that changes regionally over the next few months would also be something I'd be very keen, or I will, should I say, to keep a little bit of an eye on as well. I'm not going to use any terms such as levelling up or anything like that, but it'd be interesting to sort of see how some of those, and thinking about how some of the investment which is made on some of those regional levels, I can think of some examples, and I'm sure you might be able to have that as well. And also, of course, and some of you that are working in arts organisations again might be thinking this, particularly say as some of the social economic conditions around your audiences and bookers bite as well. Obviously the cost of living crisis, and now the fact that we are all paying a bit more for our bills, to sort of say, would that have an effect around income and around tickets in that point of view as well? Again, be really interesting to sort of see how that works and how that relates into the tracker as well. really. So hopefully just sort of a few sort of thoughts from that sort of element as well. Really, obviously, I think, you know, on the other sort of end, as Oliver also mentioned, looking and cross-referencing some of the bit back between, of course, some of our other findings, the cultural population monitor, of course, also one as well, but also as we get into this position with the audience finder surveys as well. Of course, we've talked about the audience finder data set here from the data tools, obviously in a ticketing capacity, but particularly as we're thinking about and starting to get similar amounts of data from audience finder surveys from 2020, 21, 22, and moving into 22, 23 as well. That could be interesting. But I'm saying that, I don't mean to put more work on Oliver and Elise's plate. So I'm sorry, I just have by that statement completely inverted from that sort of thing as well. But looking at that sort of thing, but of course, you know, thinking about yourselves as well, for the data tools, for people contributing audience finder data, or, you know, some of the other tools that you're using as well for obviously in agencies and consultants that we've got here as well, having a look to sort of see how that data can compare both in the ticketing and survey circumstances, to sort of see and build that picture, and using, of course, the tracker as well could be something that could be worth looking into. So hopefully just a few sort of thoughts and reflections just from me just there. Obviously, just as a small other thing for those of you that are contributing data, a sneak peek of what a few of you are going to be getting in your inboxes quite soon. There will be a reminder again to categorize your latest batch of data from the data tools in terms of production categorization. This obviously is to help you on an individual level in terms of being able to analyze your data in your dashboards at an art form level, but of course also helps us, Oliver and Elise, to really do and really add the data from that point of view as well, and contribute to that data set level. So please do, if you've got a second, or indeed are able to delegate it, of course, to one of your teams, just to assign that process or assign your productions on art form. It won't take too long as such. So hopefully that's a few sort of just reflections from me as such. If I could pass it back over to Oliver.
Yeah. That's great, Chris. Thank you, and thanks for the extra stuff on our to-do list. But joking aside, that is stuff we will be looking at, and yeah, Chris is quite right that there should hopefully be more from all sorts of perspectives as we get more kind of live audience data coming through. So, Elise, if you could just nudge us on for a quick recap of where we are up to. So, just to say, this is where to find it. Oh, I think we might have jumped a slide, but anyway, so you saw where it was on the website. That's the web address. It's covering a combination of overall audience finder data, but also some split out just for national portfolio organizations. And in time, we may look at other different groupings of organizations to make available. The data itself is filterable, it's adjustable by date range. You can select particular regions, particular segments, etc. As Chris mentioned, that could become really key over the next few months. And then really, there's lots of different ways you could be using it. But one is just a general exploration of the data, maybe getting a sense of what audience finder data is in there. When you're looking at your dashboard comparators, what kind of picture is that part of? It gives hopefully a broader context for your own data, and what that can be both within Audience Finder, but even just looking at stuff within your own box office. It gives a bit of a shape of the national picture, and hopefully, as we've shown, it allows us to kind of start to zoom in and ask particular questions to the data in terms of how particular groups are behaving, particular regions are behaving. And just a final thing to say, and I should particularly say this given that the enormous amount of work our colleagues do on Audience Finder data tools, whether that's Audience Finder Original or Audience Finder Answers, or indeed Show Stats. This is another way of getting a view on Audience Finder data. It's by no means as sophisticated as those other tools, but hopefully it does give a kind of a quick and interactive way of getting a slightly different perspective at an aggregate level. So that's sort of it from us in terms of our sort of summary.